Mr. President, we have three separate issues facing the Congress today. First, the authority of the Treasury Department to borrow to meet the nation's obligations will be reached on Tuesday. In order for borrowing to continue after Tuesday, Congress needs to raise the debt ceiling. That's the first of the three issues. The second issue that we face is the need to help our economy to become prosperous again. Unfortunately, the debate here in Congress has totally lost sight of this issue, the issue of how we can grow the economy, how we can create jobs. And the third of the three issues is the need to put in place a long-term plan to reduce the deficit and the debt. The issue of raising the debt ceiling and reducing the long-term deficit and debt have unfortunately come to be seen by many here in Congress as a single issue. So I want to urge all colleagues to take a step back and to recognize, first, that these issues are separate, and second, that failure to responsibly deal with the first of these issues, that is, failure to raise the debt limit, will greatly hamper our ability to deal with the other two issues that I've mentioned. The failure to raise the debt limit will not return our economy to prosperity. Instead, it will postpone the day when that prosperity returns. The failure to raise the debt limit will not help reduce our debt and deficit. It will add to the debt and deficit by raising interest rates for the government and for all Americans. So let's review how we got here. Since the beginning of this Congress, nearly 7 months ago, the Republican majority in the House has had a laser focus on one issue, and that is cutting spending. And to achieve that objective, the first strategy adopted by the Republican leadership in the House was to threaten a shutdown of the government unless sufficient spending cuts were agreed to. Spending cuts were agreed to, and at the final hour, Republicans agreed to pass the bill that was needed to fund the government for the balance of the fiscal year. And by that, I mean through the 31st of September of this year. So as soon as that crisis was averted and the threat to close down the government was behind us, at least for a few months, the effort shifted to a new strategy. And this strategy was to threaten a first-in-history default by the government on its financial obligations if enough additional spending cuts were not agreed to. That is, spending cuts in addition to what were agreed to in order to avert a shutdown of the government. The device for bringing about that default was refusal to extend the debt ceiling when the government's borrowing authority was scheduled to be reached, and that is the 2nd of August, next Tuesday. We should remind ourselves of what an artificial device this is that is being used for leverage in this negotiation. Congress passes the laws that determine how much revenue the federal government collects. And Congress passes the laws that determine how much we obligate the government to spend. And when the revenue that we collect is less than the amount we are committed to spend, the Secretary of the Treasury has no alternative but to borrow money to meet the obligations that Congress has taken on. So in a period like today, when the government is receiving in revenues much less than is required to meet its obligations, there are two logical actions for Congress to take. First, it can raise more revenue. Second, it can reduce the obligations of the government. But in refusing to allow the Secretary of the Treasury to borrow, we are taking neither of these logical steps. Instead, we are telling the Secretary of the Treasury to default on the obligations which this and previous Congresses have already taken on behalf of the American people. We're told by the Secretary of the Treasury that unless Congress acts, he will be forced to default or renege on our obligations beginning next week, August 2nd. The refusal to raise the debt ceiling and the threatening of default on our obligations has achieved much of what Republicans set out to achieve in this Congress. It has precipitated a crisis in order to avoid that crisis, Democrats have agreed to or acceded to the primary demands that the Republican majority in the House have made. And what are those demands? Well, there are two primary demands. One is, the first of those demands was that all of the deficit reduction be accomplished with cuts in spending. No revenue increases could be raised, no revenue could be raised from the wealthiest in our society to help close this gap between revenues and spending. No loopholes could be closed, no subsidies could be eliminated in the tax code. Democrats have agreed that the deficit reduction would not be accomplished with a balanced package of spending cuts and revenue increases, as the previous deficit reduction packages have been under President Reagan, under President George H.W. Bush, and of course under President Clinton. This deficit reduction that we are now considering would be done with spending cuts only. So that was the first demand, and it was one that Democrats have acceded to. The second demand of the Republican leadership was the totally arbitrary demand that the size of the increase in the debt ceiling not exceed the amount of spending cuts projected in the federal budget over the next 10 years. This is a demand totally lacking in any logical justification, but again, Democrats have agreed in order to achieve a solution to the immediate impasse. In order to avoid the threatened default on our obligations, Senator Reid has put forward a proposal that would lock in, according to the Congressional Budget Office, about $2.2 trillion of deficit reduction over 10 years, with cuts in both discretionary spending and mandatory spending. The Treasury Secretary would be given authority to borrow to meet the obligations that Congress has undertaken for approximately another 18 months. The proposal also puts in place a bipartisan and a bicameral committee with responsibility to present Congress with legislation to further reduce the deficit. Unfortunately, it appears that this proposal that Senator Reid has made will be opposed by many on the Republican side. Some say the cuts are not sufficiently deep and that they would rather push the country into default than agree to a mere $2.2 trillion in spending cuts. Some others say that they want to extend the debt ceiling for a shorter period so that we can have another showdown with another threatened government default 6 or 7 months from now. And some say that causing the federal government to default will not have the adverse consequences the Secretary of the Treasury has predicted, and that in fact it will have a salutary effect on both our economy and our politics. I strongly disagree with all of these views. I believe that a refusal to honor our obligations will have a major adverse consequence for our economy. I believe that Congress should act now to raise the debt limit in order to avoid these adverse consequences. And although the proposal that Senator Reid has brought forward fails the test of balance between spending cuts and revenue increases, which I would prefer, it is a plan I'm willing to support in order to head off a default on our nation's obligations. I understand that additional deficit reduction will be required in the months and years ahead, but clearly the responsible course is to do what can be done today, and that is adopt the Reid plan. Only by doing so can we once again focus on the steps that we can take to return our economy to prosperity. That is the first priority for most Americans today. it should be our first priority as well.